Welcome to Quills and Cloaks, a writing and fandom podcast, delving into the world of fandom discussions, author writing tips, and of course, all things Harry Potter. I'm Christy J. Whitney, and I will be your host and your professor, so unroll those parchments because class is in session. Hello guys! Today I'm going to be answering some of your writing questions in a short episode focused on two things, chapters and book length. So let's dive right in. So a question that I often get asked in my writing conferences and panels that I do is how long should my book be? And there's not really a simple answer to that. Honestly, it just depends. First of all, you do need to know your genre, your audience, and where you are in your career as an author. But before we get to that point, let's talk about how we measure length in writing. Because it's not page numbers, it's word count. Now, this is another area where you need to do research. Because writing a young adult contemporary book, the word count is going to be very different from writing a high fantasy or a novella or a mystery story. So if you do your research, you will find that publishers especially who are looking for certain types of stories usually want a framework of word count between this many thousand words and this many thousand words. So researching is a good starting place when you are deciding where you want to have your book published, what kind of book you're writing. And there are boundaries that as newer authors, we usually have to keep. So for YA contemporary, for young adult contemporary, you find that a lot of times the word count that publishers want might be somewhere between 50,000 words and 70,000 words. For young adult fantasy, which is what I primarily write, then it's typically going to be under 100,000 words. Now, again, we know that there are certain authors who have broken that rule with the first book that they've gotten published, but that is sort of the exception to the rule. So I would recommend if you are a newer writer, a newer author, that you stick to the word count framework that a lot of publishers give you. So word count, that is the first one. Not really a tried and true answer to that, but more along the lines of just simply do your research and know where you fit in with that particular book that you're writing. Okay, the second thing, chapters. How long should my chapters be? How many chapters should I have in a book? This is another very loaded question that doesn't have a tried and true simple answer. But I can tell you this based off of my own experience. So, and this works for anything, whether you're doing novels, novellas, or longer works of fan fiction, whatever it is you're writing, when you're trying to decide how do I break this into chapters and how long should my chapters be, I use word count rather than pages or paragraphs to decide how long my chapter is going to be. And I think about my readers because a chapter, in essence, gives your reader a chance to take a mental break. It gives them a certain amount of time where you're asking them to stay focused and to give you their undivided attention. It's a signal for a beginning and an end of a scene. So novels tend to follow as a whole a general 3-act or 5-act pattern, which is very similar to theater and films, and we'll get into that to another episode. But if you think of your novel following a 3-act or a 5-act pattern, chapters are going to be those smaller scenes within the longer acts. So they are chunks that the reader can easily finish in one sitting or might even be able to tackle one or two more. So if you get to the end of a really good chapter, a reader might say, you know what, I have enough time, I can read one more chapter. They are stopping points. They are places where we could stick a bookmark and feel like we can take a bit of a break, that we're not stopping right in the middle of some bit of action. So if a chapter is a scene, a moment, or a related series of moments, they aren't going to all be the same length. So for me, personally, I found that most of my chapters tend to fall between 1,500 words and 2,500 words. If you think about a let's say 70,000 word novel, which would be a decent size young adult contemporary novel. If you divided that up into 40 chapters, then each chapter would be 1,500 words. Now, we know that chapters are not all the same length. You might have longer chapters where you have a lot going on in one scene that needs to be connected together, or you might have a series of shorter chapters that are shorter because it's a very short moment in time, or you're trying to create some type of dramatic effect. Now, when I was first getting started and writing my first couple of books, the beginner mistake that I made was making my chapters way too long. I was finding that in the first novel that I completed, most of my chapters were between 5,000 words and 7,000 words, which is really, really long for a young adult fantasy. Now, if you're writing a high fantasy, something along the lines of Tolkien-esque in your style, that might fit in better. And within that 5,000 or 7,000 word chapter, you would have a series of breaks, perhaps. Sometimes when you read a book, you will notice that there will be a line break between shorter, kind of minute or mini scenes within a larger chapter. And you can do that with smaller ones as well. But for young adult fantasy, typically you're going to find that the majority of chapters fall between maybe the 1,000 words to 3,000 words length. It's long enough to read in one setting, but it can be broken up into a series of mini events if you want to. So again, there's not an absolute word count stipulation, but in most of what I write in my genre, yeah, I tend to stick to about 1,200 to 2,500 words. Sometimes my chapters will go longer into the 3,000s. Sometimes I've had a chapter as short as 500 words or 700 words for a certain effect. Now, novels are all driven by measures and beats. They are driving towards the conclusion of your story. Inside those big chunks, as I said, there are these moments, chapters, and it's what's going to fit into your writing the best. Now, some tips that I have: every chapter needs to have a purpose behind it. You don't just have a chapter trying to get from point A to point B. A lot of new writers fall into that pitfall that you know what you want to happen at this particular point in the story, so you just write a sort of segue chapter to try to get to that point. Well, even if you are trying to get to that next moment, your chapter needs to have a reason for being there. There needs to be a purpose. So it doesn't have to be an action chapter. It could be a dialogue chapter. It could be a narrative chapter. But the reason for the chapter still needs to be there. Your character should be learning something. You might be revealing a plot point. You might be showing a character's traits, their weaknesses, or perhaps even their growth in a certain moment. You might be showing a relationship evolving or de-evolving, or tension in a relationship, or a moment where something has brought characters together. It could be part of your story arc. But when you are writing a chapter, remember, from the beginning to the end of your chapter, there should be some driving force behind it that's beyond just, I have to get to this next point in my story. And that's really all we have. In the next episode, I'm going to be moving from writing topics back into fandom, and I will be doing an Ask Severus moment where I'll be answering some of the questions that I've received on TikTok when in character as Professor Snape. So I hope you'll join me for that next episode, and that takes care of writing questions, novel, and chapter link. Again, if you have a comment, please feel free to leave it in the YouTube section of this podcast or on my website, or even find me on Instagram or TikTok. And that is the episode for today. So blot those ink marks and collect your books, because class is dismissed.